This topic, drug and alcohol addiction, is an epidemic in this country. It's destroying lives. It's destroying lives nationwide. In the year 2014, there were 47,055 drug overdose deaths. Nearly 50,000 people no longer with us because of drugs. That's more people that were killed than were killed in car accidents. Now, you think about on the news, you see a terrible accident on the freeway. You think about the people that lost their lives, you mourn for those, and even more were killed in drug overdoses, every one of which could have been and should have been prevented. New Hampshire, in particular, is reeling from this plague. New Hampshire, in particular, is seeing the ravages of heroin. New Hampshire in 2015 had roughly 400 drug overdose deaths. That was a 17% increase from 2014, and 2014 represented a 73% increase from 2013. But that doesn't bring it as real as the rather stunning stat that 48% of the people in New Hampshire personally know someone who has abused heroin in the last 5 years. 1 in 2 people in this state personally know someone abusing heroin, and actually adults under 35, it's 60%. Nearly 2/3 of adults under 35 personally know someone who's abused heroin in the last 5 years. That's stunning. It's stunning and it's heartbreaking, and it's something that is destroying lives. And I will say on this topic, that's something I know something about in my family as well. And I'll share two stories of addiction. One that ended well and one that did not. My older sister, Miriam, was 9 years older than I am. She was my father's daughter from his first marriage. And when she was a little girl, her parents divorced. And I grew up with Miriam. She would live with us during the summer. She lived with her mom during the year. She'd live with me and my other half sister during the summertime. And as her baby brother, I would play with her. She would let me pull on her hair. Pull on her hair nonstop. She was a beautiful, beautiful woman. She was very smart. She was very charming. And Paul talked about the consequences of abandonment, the consequences of a family breaking up. Miriam, her whole life was angry. She never forgave my dad for divorcing her mother. Her whole life she had a rage. She was angry at the world. She was angry at God. And she struggled her whole life with drug and alcohol abuse. As a teenager, she partied hard. I remember as a little kid, she would steal money from me. I would save money from my allowance. She would steal money from me to go out and use it to buy alcohol, buy drugs. She ended up marrying a man who had been in and out of prison, who ended up mistreating her pretty significantly. She had a son, my nephew Joey, and then pretty soon Miriam was a single mom. She was in a car accident and had a back injury. And she got addicted to painkillers. And the painkillers spiraled down from there. She herself went to jail. Tended to be petty offenses, things like shoplifting. I remember talking to her when she was in jail, your older sister, with her crying how hard it was, how horrible the people in there were to her. I remember when I was in my late 20s, Miriam took a serious turn for the worse. She had gotten out of jail, and she had gotten with a guy there who was a more serious drug addict than she. And they were living in a crack house. And I remember my dad flew up from Texas. She was up in Philadelphia, and my father and I drove up. I was in D.C. at the time. My father and I drove up to try to get my sister out of the crack house. I remember my dad and me both taking our watches and our rings and our wallets and leaving them behind because we were driving to a crack house. I mean, we didn't know what was going to happen there, if we were going to be robbed or shot or what was going to happen. And I remember pulling Miriam out of there, and we took her to a Denny's not too far away. The two of us sat down with her for, 4 or 5 hours, trying to pull her back. But she wouldn't listen. She kept going on and on. She was angry. She said, "Daddy missed my swim meet when I was in high school." And I remember telling her, "Miriam, you've got a son, a 6th grader, Joey. He needs you." But she didn't want to listen. She wasn't prepared to change the path she was on. And she wouldn't change. So I ended up, I had just started at a law firm. I was a brand new lawyer. Had a ton of student loans, but I ended up taking a $20,000 cash advance on a credit card and using that money to put my nephew in a boarding school, Valley Forge Military Academy, which took him in. And it was actually a wonderful environment for my nephew, having some structure, having some order, having some discipline, having some basic stability in his life. And by the end of that year in school, Miriam had come back some. She was out of the crack house. She was still struggling with drug and alcohol abuse, but it was not as bad as it had been. She was able to care for Joey again. And then a few years ago, Miriam died of an overdose. Joey, her son, found her in her bed. The coroner ruled it accidental. We'll never know. We just got the call one day that Miriam was gone. These tragedies are happening in human lives all over this country. It's the human journey. It's not an easy one. It's fraught with peril, and sometimes people make decisions bound and determined to destroy themselves. You know, as a family, you wonder, could I have done more? Was there a way to pull her back? Was there a way to change the path she was on? Those are questions you never fully answer. Now, there are other journeys that have happier endings. Journeys like the one Paul bravely described. For me, that journey was my father's journey, which occurred when I was a little boy. My father was a drunk. That's one of the reasons his first family broke up. And when I was 3, my dad left us. He was not a Christian. My mother was not a Christian. We were living at the time up in Calgary. And my dad left us. He went down to Texas, decided he didn't want to be married, and he didn't want to be a dad to his son anymore. And when he was down in Houston, he was down there for several months. My mom was a single mom raising me. And a friend invited my father to a Bible study. And for whatever reason, my dad came to the Bible study. And he remembers at the end, they were taking prayer requests and they were praying. And he was struck that everyone there had challenges. And indeed, one of the women there described how her son would beat her to get money to buy drugs. And yet what struck my father in that Bible study is that the people sitting there had what the Scripture calls a peace that passes understanding. And he couldn't understand it. It made no sense to him. But he knew he wanted it. He knew he didn't have it, and he knew he wanted it. So he left that Bible study. And that night as he was leaving, the folks hosting it gave him a little pamphlet called The 4 Spiritual Laws. I suspect a number of you have read the 4 Spiritual Laws. And they suggested, why don't you just read this and come back next week? And he did, and he came back. And when he came in, they asked him, they said, did you read the little pamphlet? And he said, yeah, but it can't be that simple. That's too easy. It can't be that simple. So he began asking questions. And actually, the folks hosting the Bible study were fairly new Christians. They said, I'll tell you what, tomorrow our pastor is coming over to the house. Would you be willing to come by and just ask him the questions? And he said, sure. So the next day, he went by the house about 7 o'clock, and my dad spent 4 hours arguing with the pastor. Look, he was young, he was brilliant, he was an atheist. He was convinced he knew everything. And he argued and argued and argued with the pastor. Finally, about 11 o'clock at night, my dad said, all right, what about the man in Tibet who's never heard of Jesus? What about him? And the pastor, his name was Galen Wiley. He was the pastor of Clay Road Baptist Church. And Brother Wiley very wisely didn't take that bait. If he had, he probably would have been there another 2-3 hours arguing with my dad. Instead, he said, Raphael, I don't know about the man in Tibet. I don't know. But you've heard of Jesus. What's your excuse? And that ended up hitting my dad like a ton of bricks. And he dropped to his knees right then, gave his life to Jesus. That was April 15th, 1975. The next Sunday, my father was baptized at the church. And he drove to the airport. He bought a ticket. And he flew back to my mother and me. And it turned his life around. And my father hadn't had a drink in 40 years. Every one of us who has dealt with these demons or has dealt with loved ones grappling these demons, every one of us understands these are personal journeys. There's no uniform solution that fixes it all. It's certainly not going to be Washington, D.C. that steps in and solves these problems. It's going to be friends and family, churches, charities, loved ones, treatment centers, people working to help those who are struggling overcome their addiction. Drug addiction is a disease. Alcohol addiction is a disease. It is a vicious disease. There's so many here that are working in the field of helping people get that monkey off their back, helping people overcome that addiction. Faith and a relationship with God can be a powerful, powerful element of turning it around. It's why the church plays such an important role. You know, if you look at the history of AA, it's about 80 years ago that we were facing an epidemic in alcoholism. And doctors had given up. Alcoholics were sometimes put in asylums to die. And actually, the Northeast was a battleground for this devastating disease. The founders of AA were from the neighboring state of Vermont. Bill W. and Dr. Bob. When they formed AA, there were no government grants, and there were no nonprofits working to help alcoholics. And the program was so successful at the time that wealthy donors offered to write checks to underwrite AA. But AA turned down the money so as not to corrupt the organization. And to this day, AA takes no money from outside enterprises or sources. Instead, it's self-supporting through its members' contributions. And a program of person helping person to find God, a God of their understanding, and to rely upon that higher power to guide their life and to protect them as the program as it still works today. Those programs are what we need more and more of, helping people get back on their feet, free them from addiction. Not everyone is going to be helped. But each of us on the ground can make a real difference. Now, I will note there's a second thing that can make a real difference, which is securing the borders. If you look at what's happening right now on our borders, it is an absolute disgrace. Listen, I represent the state of Texas. We've got roughly 1,200 miles of border with Mexico. I would invite anyone to come down to the border, see for yourself what's going on there. The border is utterly unsecured. I would invite you to do as I have, to meet with farmers and ranchers there who will show you photographs of dead body after dead body after dead body, of women and children abandoned to die in the desert. Local farmers for whom it has become, sadly, a recurring experience to just encounter dead bodies of people being trafficked in, abused and abandoned by the coyotes and left to die. And it is the very same cartels that are trafficking in human beings, that are physically abusing these human beings, that are sexually abusing these human beings, that are selling God's creatures into sexual slavery. It is these very same cartels that are the drug cartels, that are bringing heroin. El Chapo. You know, Sean Penn seems to think he is a sexy and attractive character. So appreciate Hollywood for glorifying vicious, homicidal killers. What a cute and chic thing to celebrate. Someone who murders and destroys lives for a living. El Chapo's organization brings vast numbers vast quantities of drugs into this country, vast quantities of heroin. Heroin confiscations at the border have increased from about 556 kilos in 2008 to 2,100 kilos in 2012. When the border's not secure, that's what happens. You have drugs flooding into this country. And you have people in New Hampshire and elsewhere that sometimes they start with prescription painkillers. But those become harder to get, and they're more expensive, and it's cheaper and easier to go with heroin. And you're seeing the heroin usage numbers just explode. If we want to turn around the drug crisis, we have got to finally and permanently secure the border. Now, I'll tell you, we know how to do this. You know, we're told by the media over and over again, this problem can't be solved. You can't secure the border. How many times have you heard a reporter say, if you build a 10-foot wall, they'll bring an 11-foot ladder? Interestingly enough, reporters think they're very clever when they make this point. Well, if you want to see how walls work, I invite anyone to come to Israel. Take a look at their wall. When you have terrorists crossing over from Gaza, suddenly a wall works. When you've got incentive to actually make it work. That's why I've laid out a very, very detailed immigration plan. It's 11 pages, single space, chapter and verse. You know, it's easy for someone to talk about we're going to fix this problem. But specifics somehow occur a lot less frequently. Do you know right now it is existing federal law that it mandates building over 700 miles of reinforced fencing on the southern border? You know how much of that fencing this administration is allowed to be built? 36 miles. You pick up the federal statutes, you pick up the federal law, you'd say, oh, this wall is mandatory. And yet the administration refuses to comply with it. We need to solve this problem. We need to build the wall. We need to triple the Border Patrol. When you talk with law enforcement on the ground, when you talk with law enforcement in South Texas, they consistently say boots on the ground are the most important piece. We need to increase fourfold the fixed wing and rotary wing aircraft so that you use technology if there's an attempted incursion, if you happen to see someone carrying an 11-foot ladder. Then the technology directs the boots on the ground. We have someone attempting to cross at this point. He'll be easy to spot. He's the guy with the 11-foot ladder. We can use the tools to solve this. And an important thing to understand, it's not that we lack the know-how. It's that we lack the political will. It's that as a political matter, the Democratic Party does not want to solve this problem. And as a political matter, far too many Republicans don't either. That sadly, stopping the drug traffic gets de-emphasized because their policy view instead is to open the borders to illegal immigration. On the Democratic side, I think an awful lot of folks view the people coming across as new voters. New Democratic voters. You know, there's a politically correct term now for illegal aliens. It's called undocumented Democrats. But it's not complicated why these politicians are saying more and more and more because we think we stay in power. If we bring as many of them in and make them citizens, then they vote for us. But what's, if anything, even more cynical is all of the Republicans who listen to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who listen to Wall Street, who listen to the lobbyists in Washington, all of whom view illegal immigration as cheap labor. They think it's fabulous. Cheap labor, drive down wages. What could be better? But it's that political commitment that results in our not securing the border and not stopping the flow of drugs into this country. That political commitment is wrong. It is, number one, not standing up for the working men and women of this country. It is resulting in economic stagnation. It is resulting in wages. Median wages today are the same as they were in 1996, 20 years with no increase in median wages. You want to understand why the American middle class is furious with Washington. With politicians of both parties, it's because the policies of Washington keep undermining the American middle class. But if you want to stop the drug traffic, you've got to have an administration committed to, we will secure the border. You know, just today, the head of the Border Patrol Union testified in Congress that this administration ordered the Border Patrol to stand down. Stand down. Don't hold illegal aliens. If you apprehend them, release them. And don't track them. Once you release them, you're not allowed to track them. Now, I'll tell you, I've visited with Border Patrol agents. You want to talk about law enforcement with low morale. They're out there risking their lives. I've talked to Border Patrol agents where they describe the drug cartels firing 50 caliber rifles at them. I mean, they are risking their lives fighting vicious criminals. And their political supervisors don't let them do their job. What lunacy is this? Where we're not only not securing our borders, we're actively preventing law enforcement from securing the borders. It makes no sense. So the focus of this gathering today is focusing on drug addiction and alcohol addiction. It's focusing on the human toll, the human consequences that all of us, one way or another, have been touched by. And I will say the solution to this is going to come at the state and local level. It's going to come from the church. It's going to come from charities. It's going to come from friends and family and loved ones stepping forward and saying, we're here for you. We'll be on this journey with you. But it's also going to come from a federal government that actually does its job and secures the border. And I will tell you this. If I'm elected president, you have my solemn commitment. We will secure the borders. And we will end this plague of rampant drugs flooding into this country and destroying lives all across this nation. Thank you.